Socrates exist? A lot of people think about this question. Some of us argue that he would be the alter ego of Plato, another Greek philosopher, and probably one of the most influential philosopher period. And some other think that Socrates existed, that he was just a guy in ancient Greece walking around the marketplace, the agora, in dirty clothes, stopping powerful people, politicians, and other influential people, and asking them questions. With his wit, he didn't lecture. He listened until people realized they didn't know what they were talking about, or that their point was stupid. Socrates called himself a gadfly, a biting fly. He said that Athens was like a big lazy horse, and he was the fly, or the mosquito, let's say, I think it would be even better, that was biting it to keep it awake and moving. One day, the oracle said, "No one is wiser than Socrates," the oracle of Delphi, if I recall. Socrates was confused because he felt like he knew nothing. He went around interviewing people who he thought were wise and intelligent to prove that the oracle was wrong, only to realize that they were all faking their knowledge. They were all faking their wit, their wise attributes. He concluded that he was the only one honest enough to admit his ignorance. And he ended up with that famous quote, "I know nothing except the fact of my ignorance. The only thing that I know is that I don't know." And this quote is often misinterpreted. A lot of people don't really understand what it means, so let me break it down for you. It means that he knows enough so that he realizes what he doesn't know. And because he knows enough of what he doesn't know, he puts himself on the way to try to close the gap and basically make that bridge between his ignorance and his actual knowledge. Because of course, Socrates was a man who had a lot of knowledge, was intelligent, and it would be hard to argue against it. Most people think that learning is about adding new info, reading new stuff, and making sure that you're fully aware of what is going on. Socrates thought that it was more about stripping away false beliefs or other dogmas. What he said is that you need to ask for a definition. For example, what is justice? What is peace? What is war? And you have to wait for the other person to tell you a confident answer. And then you ask follow-up question that exposes contradiction in that answer. For example, a lot of people today would argue that democracy is the right choice of politics and that it should be the government that we should have. And he often had the discussion actually with the Athenians. And he had this very famous conversation that I personally love. He said, well, let's imagine that our society is a boat. And to drive this boat, who would you choose? Would you choose a panel of people represented fairly amongst the population who perhaps have little to no knowledge of the sea and of driving boats or commanding? Or would you choose one person who would be in charge, would be put in charge of everything with years of experience that would have total control over everything? And actually, a lot of people, and probably you included, you might think, yeah, well, I choose the second part. I'll choose the experienced one, even if he's a tyrant, authoritarian figure at least, or somebody with full powers. I think it's the best way to put it, not necessarily a tyrant, but just somebody who has powers over the others. But it's not democratic, right? So it's not good. So why do you say that democracy is a good thing? Etc., etc. You get the picture. And he was doing that. He was probably one of the most annoying person in his time. And doing that with a lot of people, especially when you have like politicians in front of you or war chiefs or very rich people, must be quite frustrating because nobody really wants an honest question, and nobody really wants an honest answer most of the time. And that's actually what Socrates believed. That he believed that to grow and to become more knowledgeable and more intelligent, you had to be blatantly honest, and you had to ask the questions that nobody wants to ask, and you had to answer the questions that nobody wanted to answer. So in today's world, when somebody wants to, for example, to say, well, I want to be successful, so you might ask, what is success? Is it money? If a rich man is miserable, is he successful? For example, if the person is depressed, has no family, or has an IQ inferior of 80, 90, whatever it is that you might think that would make that person miserable. And it would force the other person, it's actually a rhetoric, to actually think and to perhaps reconsider his position. The goal is not necessarily to win the argument, but to reach the truth together. It's the intellectual midwifery is helping you give birth to your own ideas. And this is actually quite interesting. And one of the second aspect of Socrates is actually one of the philosophers that I really like, because Socrates was the man who I think I started philosophy with. He was the first book I read. I mean, the book from Plato, because Socrates, as a fun fact, never wrote any books. And that's why a lot of people doubt of his existence, because most of what we know comes from Plato. And in his trial, I felt like I didn't understand when I read it at first. I thought, well, he seems like a very intelligent man with a lot of wit and a lot of, I would say, deepness. And I understand where he's getting at, to put everything into questions and to basically reconsider our positions or reconsider what we call truth, and to understand that perhaps truth is like a dice. And I think it's Plato who said that. The truth is the dice, and the dice face is basically what you consider the truth. But it might not be universal. It might not be actually true as a law, let's say. And when I read that book the first time, I didn't realize that there was more depth to it. I didn't realize that one of the things that made Socrates such an influential philosopher, person at the time, if he indeed existed, as we established, was that he refused to escape death. So in the book, if I recall correctly, and excuse me if I don't, because I don't have it in front of me, it's been a few years that I read it. Socrates goes to trial because the people of Athens judge him for, and they think that he's perverting the youth, that he's basically putting new ideas into people, that he's basically creating new gods and changing the perspective of young people. So, and his students and a lot of people want basically to ask him questions and to ask if indeed he's doing that, and if so, then he's guilty. He's guilty of the worst crime. The worst crime is to think, it's to revolt against the established order, right? And that's why today we call it extremism. If you disagree with the order established, whatever it is that you think, you're only extreme if the other person is at the other extreme. So what you call extreme left, far right, blah, blah, depends on your position. So the further right you are, the further left somebody on your left will be. Because for you, you're so much on the right, but you get the idea. It's all a game. And it's very interesting because what he said is that he'd rather die. He has to die for philosophy. It's what he has to do, because otherwise philosophy dies. Because if he indeed lives for philosophy, and that's, I think, the biggest difference with nowadays philosophy, where we see philosophy as a ton of books and a ton of people in their rooms speaking about topics like that. Take me, for example. No, philosophy is about embracing your life, and it's exactly what I'm trying to do with the podcast. Is not necessarily to talk about things, but it's more like to reconsider my life choices, to tell you about your life choices, and to perhaps examine that life together. And that's exactly what Socrates died for. And that's one of the principles that he says. He says, an unexamined life is not worth living. Why did he say that? Well, he believed that most people are on the autopilot. We follow traditions, religions, career paths because we were told to do so, not because we chose them. Let's say if you were born in a Muslim, in a Jewish or Christian family, You might think to yourself, well, this is the right thing to do. Well, perhaps because you were born into it. But what if now you had to really reconsider, read the three books, and choose for yourself? Which one would you choose? And that's, I think, where it gets interesting, because it's like it puts us in a very uncomfortable position, especially religion, because it's such a touchy subject. But if you talk about, let's say, politics or career path, let's say career path, so it's less, I would say, tyrannical as an idea. But if you say, well, I want to become a doctor, well, why is it? Well, if you look around you, maybe in your family you have doctors. Maybe in your parents wanted you to become a doctor. But maybe you didn't want to do that, or maybe you did, but then you realize, well, what if I became that? Maybe I would be more happy. Or what if I, it chose differently? What if I changed my perspective because I was actually asking myself questions, becoming more intelligent, more resilient, more intellectually gifted? It would allow me to actually rethink this position and be more inclined to change my perspective. And that's, I think, a big difference between an opinion and a perspective and this exercise of examining your life. Because when you are on autopilot, you don't really reconsider. You might read a lot of things, you might do a lot and you're thinking, yeah, man, I'm on top of it. I'm studying, I'm working, and I'm actually reading about this, and it changed my perspective on that, blah blah. The reality is that you might not do it. And you might not do it because you're not asking yourself the tough question. You ask yourself the easy questions, such as, I don't know, like, does God exist? Is this choice the right for me? Those are very easy questions when you think about it. They're tough for some people, but they're relatively easy because you can answer that. And you don't have to answer. But it's harder to say that, for example, what am I doing tonight? I'm smoking joint with my friends. Maybe I should do something better. That's another thing, because now you're quitting the autopilot. I'm drinking wine or beers with some people that I don't like, that I don't really appreciate for who they are, but how they make me feel. And that's super hard, man. Trust me, it's very hard. And a lot of us, we don't ask ourselves those questions, and me included. Sometimes I do things on autopilot, and I have to catch myself, doing that and realizing, man, this is not what I want. This is not who I want to be. This is not the life that I chose. And this is definitely not the people I want to be associated with. I'd rather be on my own. For Socrates, the soul, it's not a ghost. It's your character. He calls the soul the psyche. It's, he argued that doing the wrong doings or doing wrong harms the doer more than the victim because it rots your character. For example, if you were to cheat on your wife or cheat on your husband, it's not necessarily that you're hurting your partner. It's not just that. You're hurting yourself because you're rotting like a bad fruit. And no longer that fruit can be consumed. And this is where it gets dangerous. Because if you no longer can be consumed, then who the fuck is going to want that orange? And if an orange is rotten, then usually it ends up in the trash. So the challenge is, why do you believe what you believe? If you can't explain why you value something, do you actually value it, or do you just echo your parents, the internet, the books that you've read, anything basically that you're getting that from? And so he concludes with, the unexamined life is not worth living. And I referenced the trial, but I want to be a little bit more extensive on that. The powerful people of Athens got tired of being embarrassed by the questions that Socrates was asking. So they put him on trial for corrupting the youth, as I said, not believing in the gods and over shit. He didn't beg for mercy. Basically told the jury, you should be, and that was the most provocative thing that he said. He said, not only I shouldn't be here, but you should be paying me for the service I provide the city. He was someone very provocative, and I think it's one of the traits of his character that a lot of people, I think, got upset with and realized that, okay, he cannot have the guy anymore in the city because it's just disturbing the peace at some point. It's just this very annoying guy was constantly biting like a mosquito at night, or the fly and the horse, as he said, or the donkey. And eventually he was sentenced to death by drinking poison. And actually he had a chance to escape. Plato even offered to pay for his release, but he refused, because basically what he said, and that's the part of Mists, when I told you I missed something from the book the first time I read it, but the first time I read it was like, I think 16 or 15. He refused because he believed that in following the law, if the law is used unfairly against him, he should believe in following the law. But not the law that people would think, the law of philosophy, the law of his life. And even if that would end up in his death, he refused to escape so that philosophy could live. He proved that his philosophy wasn't just talk. Because if he was to say, okay, I'm going to buy my way out, like a lot of politicians or modern people would do, because actually nobody wants to die, you would prove that what you're staying for is actually just to talk. You're not ready to die. If you're willing to die for what you think is right, then you really believe that what you're thinking is right. And you're not just talking the talk. You're walking the walk, man. So Socrates told us that questions are more powerful than answers. And actually answering is easier than asking yourself following up questions. So whenever you feel certain about an opinion or about something, ask yourself, why? Ask yourself that 1, 2, 3 times, and try to think by yourself. And actually has an interesting quote that is, to find yourself, you have to think for yourself. So to recap, you have to know that you don't know. You have to accept that you don't know something so that you can progress. And you need to have a healthy soul, a virtuous soul, by doing what is right and not necessarily doing what makes you happy, which is a different thing. Finally, to ask yourself the questions that are hard to yourself or to others to find your own truth, and to never let peace or a conflict eat you, but rather to try to make it an actual philosophy that you can live for rather than talk about. That's all for me. Peace.